The July wind swept across the Nebraska territory with relentless force, carrying dust devils that danced between the sagebrush and buffalo grass, like restless spirits. Eliza Whitmore pressed her face to the small window of the Concord stagecoach, watching the endless prairie roll past under a sky so vast it seemed to swallow the horizon whole. Summer 1867. At 20, she carried everything she owned in a battered trunk secured to the coach's roof, along with dreams that felt both fragile and fierce. The letter clutched in her gloved hands promised salvation, steady employment for an experienced seamstress at Agnes Felixson's boarding house in Willow Springs, $2 a week, plus room and board. Enough to build the independent life she'd dreamed of, since consumption had claimed both her parents, leaving her with nothing but needle-pricked fingers and an unshakable determination to forge her own path. "Willow Springs, miss," the driver called down through the swirling dust. End of the line. The town that emerged from the heat shimmer looked prosperous enough to justify her optimism. Fresh-cut lumber gleamed white in the afternoon sun, while glass windows caught the light like scattered diamonds. The three-story Willow Springs Hotel dominated Main Street with frontier respectability, its painted sign promising clean beds and Christian values. But it was the massive saloon across the street that truly commanded attention. The Lantern's End sprawled across half a city block, its elaborate facade painted in garish reds and golds that pulsed in the dancing heat. Even in the afternoon, piano music and raucous laughter spilled through its batwing doors, mixing with the more mundane sounds of commerce. Men moved in and out with steady rhythm, their faces flushed with whiskey and whatever other entertainments waited within. As Eliza stepped down from the stagecoach, her green calico dress wrinkled from days of travel, she noticed how conversations paused when she appeared. Not unusual single women were rare commodities in frontier towns. But something in the way certain men looked at her with calculating hunger that had nothing to do with courtship made her pull her shawl closer despite the oppressive heat. "You looking for work, miss?" The voice belonged to a well-dressed man who'd emerged from the saloon's shadow. Tall and lean with dark hair pomaded, despite the heat, he carried himself with smooth confidence. His black suit was immaculate, his white shirt spotless, and his smile revealed teeth too perfect to be natural. "Felix Garrett at your service. Couldn't help noticing you're traveling alone." There was something in his tone, a subtle emphasis on alone, that set every instinct screaming warnings. But she maintained composure, years of dealing with mill overseers having taught her to hide thoughts behind polite neutrality. "I'm looking for Agnes Felixson's boarding house," she replied carefully. "She's expecting me." Felix's smile never wavered, but something flickered behind his dark eyes, surprise perhaps, or calculation. "Agnes, you can't say I'm familiar with that particular establishment. But perhaps I could be of assistance. The Lantern's End employs several young ladies in various capacities. Good wages, comfortable accommodations, and the kind of protection a woman needs in these rough territories." The way he said various capacities and protection sent ice water through her veins, but she kept her expression neutral. "Thank you, but I have arrangements." Her inquiries around town quickly revealed the devastating truth. At the general store, Jeremiah Walsh scratched his balding head and admitted he'd never heard of Agnes Felixson. The hotel clerk confirmed no such establishment existed. Even the postmaster shook his head apologetically. "Sorry, miss, but there ain't been no Agnes Felixson gettin' mail here. You certain you got the right town?" The certainty crumbled like sand as the terrible reality sank in. The job advertisement that had cost her last savings was a fiction designed to trap desperate women far from home and help. With nowhere else to turn and her traveling funds reduced to less than $3, Eliza made the fateful decision to enter the Lantern's End. The interior was impressive, in its gaudy opulence, polished mahogany bar crystal chandeliers casting prismatic light across green felt tables where serious-faced men played serious games. The smell hit her immediately: tobacco smoke, spilled whiskey, unwashed bodies, and something else underneath. Something sour and desperate that spoke of human misery, masked by false gaiety. Felix welcomed her with the same calculating smile. "Changed your mind about that employment opportunity, I see. Wise decision. A woman alone in these territories needs protection, needs someone looking out for her interests." "What exactly would my duties involve?" Eliza asked. "Serving drinks to our more discerning customers, keeping the gaming tables tidy, perhaps providing companionship to lonely travelers." His smile took on a sharper edge. "The work ain't difficult for a woman with the right attitude. And the compensation is quite generous, more than you'd make in any respectable establishment, I can promise you that." But when Eliza asked to see the accommodations, Felix's manner shifted subtly. The smile remained, but his eyes grew harder, more predatory. "Perhaps you'd like to start immediately," he suggested smoothly. "There's a room ready upstairs, and my associate Robert McKinnon can explain your specific responsibilities." Robert McKinnon materialized beside their table as if summoned. A stocky man with graying hair and hands like ham hocks, he possessed quiet menace that came from years of enforcing other men's will through violence. But it was the crescent-shaped scar curving from his left temple to his jaw that Eliza would remember most clearly, a mark that would haunt her nightmares. "New girl?" McKinnon asked, looking her up and down with impersonal evaluation. His voice carried a slight Irish accent that might have been charming in other circumstances. "Pretty little thing. Should do well with the right guidance. Miss Whitmore is considering our employment offer," Felix replied smoothly. "I thought you might show her the accommodations, explain the house rules." As they spoke, Eliza's attention was drawn to a narrow hallway leading toward storage rooms. Most doors were closed, but one stood slightly ajar, and through the gap she glimpsed something that froze her blood. Iron bars across a small window, a chain bolted to the wall, and the soft, hopeless sobbing of a young woman. Her sharp intake of breath must have been audible because suddenly McKinnon's thick fingers closed around her upper arm with bruising force. "Back rooms ain't for customers, miss," he said with false friendliness. "These areas are restricted employee housing, you understand. Privacy is important in our line of work." But Eliza had seen enough. As McKinnon steered her toward the rear exit, she caught glimpses of other reinforced doors, heard other sounds of distress. This wasn't a saloon, it was a prison. "Think about our offer," McKinnon suggested as he released her at the back door. "Word of advice, though, this territory can be dangerous for women traveling alone, especially ones who might be carrying certain diseases. Reputation's a fragile thing out here, if you take my meaning." The threat was unmistakable. Accept their terms or face destruction through rumors that would make her unemployable anywhere in the territory. By the next morning, the character assassination was underway with devastating efficiency. Mrs. Patterson at the general store refused to serve her, claiming she didn't want that sort handling merchandise. The hotel clerk demanded immediate payment and suggested she find accommodations more suited to her circumstances. Even the preacher crossed the street to avoid her, his face twisted with righteous disgust. In less than 24 hours, Eliza Whitmore had been transformed from a respectable young woman into a pariah whose very presence was considered contaminating. With no money for stagecoach fare and nowhere to turn, Eliza did the only thing she could: she ran. The chase began at sunset, when evening wind swept down from the hills. 3 riders emerged from the gathering dusk as Eliza stumbled through tall grass along Willow Creek, her torn skirt catching on every thistle and bramble. Their yellow rain slickers gleamed like beetle shells as they closed the distance with methodical precision. "There she is." Deputy Simon Hayes called to his companions, his voice carrying authority of a man who'd never faced consequences. "The diseased whore who's been spreading her filth through town." Simon was a lean man of 35, with pale eyes and a mustache that failed to soften the cruel line of his mouth. He wore his tin star like a shield, using legal authority to justify acts that would be called murder in civilized places. Eliza's lungs burned as she forced trembling legs to carry her deeper into the creek bottom. The riders gained ground easily, their horses covering terrain that forced her to struggle through knee-deep mud. "Should have taken Felix's offer when you had the chance," Hayes shouted, clearly enjoying the hunt. "Now you get to learn what happens to troublemakers in Willow Springs." The lariat settled around her ankle with deadly precision, the braided leather tightening as Hayes spurred his horse backward. Eliza's feet were jerked from under her, sending her sprawling face first into creek mud with bone-jarring force. As the rope tightened and began dragging her backward through the mire, Eliza clawed desperately at slippery ground, her fingernails tearing against roots and stones. Creek water filled her mouth and nose, threatening to drown her. "Drag her to the county line," Hayes ordered with casual cruelty. "Let the coyotes finish what we started. Make it look like she got lost, wandered off into the wilderness. Happens all the time to women traveling alone." That was when Chaska appeared. The Lakota warrior emerged from the cattails like something conjured from darkness itself, tall and lean, moving with fluid grace despite treacherous footing. His buckskin clothes were darkened with moisture, but intricate beadwork in blues and whites decorated his shirt. His long black hair was tied back with a leather strip woven through with small eagle feathers that caught what little light remained. Without hesitation, he waded into the creek and cut the rope with a single stroke of his bone-handled knife. Strong hands pulled her upright, steadying her shaking form against his solid frame. For a moment suspended outside time, he pressed his forehead against hers, not romantically, but with simple human connection of one survivor recognizing another. His dark eyes, the color of obsidian, searched her mud-streaked face with intensity that made her forget the cold and the fear, even the approaching riders. "Breathe," he murmured, his voice carrying soft cadence of his native tongue beneath English words. "Ayo Tankapi, sit with me in this breath." Eliza found her frantic gasping slowing to match his steady rhythm. In that shared moment, with creek water swirling around their ankles and danger closing from all sides, something passed between them, recognition of kindred spirits in a world that showed little mercy to either. "Step away from her, redskin," Hayes commanded, his revolver appearing with practiced ease. "This ain't your concern, and it sure as hell ain't your territory." Chaska positioned himself protectively between Eliza and the guns, his own rifle materializing from beneath his robe. The weapon was a Spencer repeating carbine, its brass receiver gleaming dully, military surplus, deadly accurate in practiced hands. "The woman breathes," he said simply, voice carrying no challenge but absolute conviction. "That makes it my concern. She's diseased." The second rider spat, keeping his horse dancing nervously. "Saw her come out of the lantern's end, looking like she'd been rolling with every cowpoke in the territory, probably spreading the pox to anyone fool enough to touch her." "I saw them." Eliza gasped, finding her voice despite chattering teeth. Behind the poker tables, they had girls locked up back there, young ones chained to the walls like animals. The warrior's expression didn't change, but she felt tension coil through his body like steel spring being wound tight. His grip shifted on his rifle thumb, finding the hammer. From darkness beyond the creek came the cry of a hawk, answered by another, then another. But these weren't birds, and all 4 riders knew it. The horses began to fidget, sensing danger approaching on silent feet. Chaska. The name came from darkness, spoken in Lakota, but clearly recognizable. Hayes and his men looked around nervously, realizing they were no longer the hunters. 2 Indian ponies burst from the willows upstream, their riders whooping as they charged directly at the mounted men. But this wasn't wild attack. It was precision warfare designed to create confusion rather than casualties. Reins tangled horses reared and collided, and suddenly the night erupted in chaos. In the confusion, Chaska grabbed Eliza's wrist and pulled her deeper into the marsh. His fingers found her pulse point, feeling the rapid flutter beneath pale skin, growing cold from exposure. "Can you run?" he asked quietly. She nodded, not trusting her voice. "Then run. Inajinpo, let's go." They plunged into the cattails, dropping low as gunshots cracked behind them. The marsh grass closed around them like a curtain, muffling sound and concealing their passage from cursing men who thrashed through shallows in increasingly desperate pursuit. Chaska moved with the silence of smoke, guiding her along paths that seemed to exist only in his memory. They crawled through mud, and standing water pressed so close together that she could feel the steady beat of his heart against her shoulder. His buckskin shirt carried scents of wood smoke, sage, and something wild and clean that spoke of vast spaces under endless sky. Behind them, the shouting continued, punctuated by gunshots and frustrated whinnying of horses that couldn't navigate treacherous ground. But sounds grew fainter as Chaska led her deeper into the maze of channels and islands he knew as well as the rooms of his own lodge. When they finally stopped beneath overhanging branches of a massive cottonwood, Eliza found herself studying the man who had appeared from nowhere to save her life. In starlight filtering through leaves, she could see strong lines of his face, the way his dark eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, even as he tended to her needs. There was a scar along his left cheekbone, old and white-shaped like a crescent moon. Another across the knuckles of his right hand spoke of fights won through skill rather than luck. These weren't marks of a savage, but of a warrior who'd learned to survive in a world offering few second chances. "Who are you?" she whispered. "Chaska," he replied, voice carrying the same quiet strength she'd heard when he faced down Hayes. "Waste good, and you are not what they claim." It wasn't a question. Somehow, in that brief moment when he'd held her gaze in the creek, he'd seen past the mud and blood and terror to the truth beneath. The knowledge settled around her heart like a warm blanket. "No," she agreed, watching his eyes. "I'm not." Thunder rolled across the prairie in the distance, though the sky remained clear. But both understood it wasn't weather they were hearing, it was the sound of more riders, more men with guns and ropes, and the kind of authority that came from barrel ends. As if reading her thoughts, Chaska shifted closer, his shoulder touching hers in the cramped space. The contact was electric, sending warmth through her chilled body that had nothing to do with shared heat and everything to do with the first human kindness she'd encountered since arriving in this territory. "The storm," he said quietly, his breath warm against her ear, "has only just begun. But storms pass, and we will weather this one together. Mitakuye o yasin, we are all related." Dawn brought no relief from oppressive heat that had gripped the Nebraska territory for weeks. The sun rose like a brass coin in a cloudless sky, promising another day when temperature would climb past 100 degrees and stay there. But it also brought the Lakota camp, 17 lodges arranged in rough circle around a central fire pit, their painted buffalo hide covers already warming in early light. As Chaska guided their stolen pony through the awakening camp, Eliza felt the weight of curious stares pressing down on her shoulders. Children paused in morning chores to watch her pass, their dark eyes bright with curiosity and wariness. Women emerged from lodges with expressions needing no translation, concern, suspicion, and something that might have been fear. The conversations that began around the fire pit were conducted in rapid Lakota, but their tone was unmistakable. Eliza didn't need to understand words to recognize the sound of a community debating whether to shelter a stranger or cast her out for protection. "Your people don't want me here," she observed, noting how several warriors had positioned themselves between her and the center of camp. "They don't want war," Chaska corrected, voice carrying weariness of someone who'd had this argument before. "And you represent danger they don't understand. White woman alone means soldiers asking questions. Questions lead to accusations. Accusations lead to reservations, or worse. The Takala way the Kit Fox warrior's hard path." He led her toward a lodge set slightly apart from others, its entrance facing east toward the rising sun, according to tradition. The buffalo hide cover was painted with scenes of hunting and battle artistic skill, evident even to Eliza's untrained eye. Eagle feathers hung from lodge poles, moving gently in morning breeze, carrying scents of cooking fires and horses. "This is your home?" she asked. "My teepee," he confirmed, lifting the entrance flap with careful courtesy. "It will shelter you while we decide what must be done. Tipi Mitawa, my lodge, welcomes you." The interior was larger than she'd expected, easily 15 feet across, with floor covered in thick robes and woven mats. A fire pit occupied the center, its carefully banked coals providing warmth against morning chill, despite growing heat outside. Personal belongings hung from lodge poles, weapons, medicine bundles, clothing decorated with intricate beadwork. It was neat, organized, and utterly foreign to anything in her previous experience. "Sit," Chaska said, disappearing briefly and returning with a soft deerskin robe. He draped it over her shoulders with gentle care, his fingers barely brushing her skin, but sending shivers through her that had nothing to do with cold. The hide was incredibly supple, carrying scents of wood smoke and sage that seemed to wrap around her like an embrace. For the first time since leaving Pennsylvania, Eliza felt something approaching safety, not false security of walls and locks, but deeper comfort of being genuinely protected by someone who asked nothing in return. As he coaxed coals back to life with practiced movements, adding small pieces of dried wood until flames began to dance, Eliza found herself watching his hands. They were calloused from years of hunting and fighting, knuckles scarred from battles won and lost, yet they moved with surprising delicacy as he tended the fire. "Your shoulder," he said, suddenly, dark gaze focusing on a tear in her blouse. "You're bleeding. Wee blood speaks of pain that needs healing." She looked down and saw he was right. A thorn from their passage through cattails had left a jagged cut just below her collarbone, hidden until now by dried mud and torn clothing. The wound was starting to throb as shock wore off. Chaska reached toward her, then stopped, his hand hovering inches from her skin. The pause stretched between them, filled with unspoken questions and tension that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with awareness. "Permission," he asked softly, the English word, followed by something in Lakota that sounded like a prayer. The courtesy in that single word nearly undid her. After brutal handling from Hayes and his men, the simple request for consent felt like a gift beyond price. It spoke of respect, of seeing her as a person rather than an object to be used and discarded. "Yes," she whispered. "How, yes?" His touch was warm and gentle as he eased torn fabric aside to examine the wound, his fingers barely grazing her skin, but leaving trails of fire in their wake. The cut wasn't deep, but it was dirty, and would need cleaning to prevent infection that killed more pioneers than Indian arrows ever did. From a parfleche bag hung near his sleeping robes, He produced supplies, speaking of extensive medical knowledge. Clean cloth, a small leather bottle smelling of herbs, and alcohol sinew thread, fine enough for delicate needlework. The care with which he'd assembled these materials suggested someone who tended many wounds, probably including his own. "This will sting," he warned, dampening cloth with liquid from the bottle. "But it will clean the poison from your wound. Why a zanka to make healthy again?" Eliza bit her lip as he cleaned the wound herbal solution, burning like fire against torn skin. But his touch remained gentle throughout movements, economical and sure. When he began stitching the cut closed with tiny, precise sutures, she found herself watching his face instead of his hands. There was something almost sacred in his concentration, a stillness that spoke of deep wells of patience and endurance. This was a man who had learned to survive, not through violence, though he was clearly capable of it, but through careful attention to detail and understanding of how small actions could mean the difference between life and death. "There," he said, tying off the final stitch with practiced ease. "It will heal clean if you keep it dry and don't strain the shoulder too much. Ask Kate to be made whole again." "Thank you." The words seemed inadequate for what he'd done, not just medical attention, but simple human kindness that came with it. "I don't know how to repay you. In my world, no debt," he replied, settling back on his heels. "We help because help is needed. This is the way. Woe pay harmony, peace between us." Before she could respond, voices outside the tipi grew louder and more agitated. The sound of approaching footsteps suggested someone important was coming to call, and from Chaska's expression, it wasn't a social visit. The entrance flap was pushed aside without ceremony, revealing a woman who entered with bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Perhaps 45 years old, she wore a dress of soft doeskin decorated with porcupine quill work that must have taken months to complete. Her graying hair was braided with silver ornaments that caught firelight, and her dark eyes held authority that came from years of healing both bodies and spirits. She spoke rapidly in Lakota, her tone leaving no doubt about her feelings regarding Eliza's presence. The words came fast and sharp, filled with what sounded like warnings and recriminations. Chaska responded in the same language, his voice calm but firm, never rising, despite obvious tension. The exchange continued for several minutes, with the woman's gestures becoming increasingly emphatic. She pointed toward Eliza, toward the entrance, toward some distant threat only she could see. Finally, she turned those penetrating dark eyes on Eliza herself, studying her with intensity of a hawk evaluating potential prey. When she spoke again, it was in accented but clear English. "I am Ayana," she said, voice carrying weight of absolute authority. "Healer of this band, Pehuta Wing medicine woman, and you are the white woman who brings soldiers to our door." "I didn't mean to bring trouble," Eliza replied, meeting the older woman's gaze directly despite intimidation factor. "I was only trying to escape from men who wanted to hurt me, to use me in ways that no woman should endure." "Escape what exactly?" Ayana's tone suggested she'd heard such stories before and found most wanting. "What did you see that made you run like a hunted animal?" Taking a deep breath, Eliza told Ayana everything: the false job advertisement that had lured her west, the locked rooms behind the lantern's end, where young women sobbed in chains, McKinnon's threats, and swift character assassination that had followed her refusal to comply. She held nothing back, describing casual cruelty she'd witnessed, and systematic way her reputation had been destroyed in less than a day. Ayana listened without interruption, her expression growing increasingly grim as the story unfolded. When Eliza finished, the healer was quiet for a long moment, weathered hands clasped tightly in her lap. "You saw cages," she said finally, "with girls inside. Young ones, you say? Yes. I heard crying, saw chains bolted to walls. It wasn't a saloon, it was a prison. A place where women disappear and are never spoken of again. Something flickered across Ayana's weathered features. Pain, perhaps, or recognition of something she'd hoped never to hear confirmed. She spoke again in Lakota, this time to Chaska, her voice urgent and filled with what sounded like questions. "What is she saying?" Eliza asked when the conversation paused. Chaska's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried weight of old pain and fresh anger. "She says you bring storm inside our camp," he replied. "But the storm was already here. Has been here for more than a year, taking our daughters when they venture too close to white settlements. Wiccankala young women stolen like horses in the night." Before either woman could ask what he meant, new voices arose outside, deeper, older, carrying weight of authority and age. Multiple footsteps approached the teepee, and from the sound, half the camp's leadership was converging on Chaska's lodge. "The council calls," he said, getting to his feet with fluid grace despite obvious reluctance. "They want to know why I brought you here, against their direct orders. Omnitzai, the gathering of wise men who must decide your fate. Orders: to stay away from white settlements. There have been incidents over past months, cattle missing fences, cut travelers robbed. The army patrols closer to our territory each day, looking for excuses to force us onto the reservation." His dark eyes met hers with intensity that made her breath catch. "By helping you, I may have given them the excuse they've been seeking. The Tokala way, I have walked the Kit Fox warrior's hard path." Eliza felt her heart sink as full implications became clear. By helping her, Chaska had risked not just his own safety, but that of his entire people. The knowledge settled over her like a lead blanket, heavy with guilt and responsibility she wasn't sure she could bear. "I should go," she said, starting to rise despite pain in her shoulder. "I won't be the cause of war between your people and the army. There has to be another way." "No." Ayana's voice cut across her words like a blade, sharp enough to stop her movement entirely. The healer was staring at her with an expression Eliza couldn't read. Part recognition, part fear, part something that might have been hope. "You stay," Ayana continued, tone brooking no argument. "Rest, heal. The council will decide what must be done, but you do not run again. Running solves nothing, and the darkness follows wherever you go. But if my presence here endangers your people—" "Child," Ayana interrupted, voice gentling slightly, but losing none of its authority. "Some storms cannot be avoided. They can only be weathered with courage and wisdom. Woe pay, and sometimes wisdom means standing in the storm's path rather than fleeing from it." She looked meaningfully at Chaska's weathered features, creased with concern. "And some truths must be faced no matter the cost, even if they lead us through the valley of shadows." The healer left as abruptly as she'd arrived, entrance flap falling closed behind her with soft whisper of hide against hide. Outside, sounds of heated discussion grew louder, punctuated by occasional shouts that needed no translation to convey their emotional weight. Eliza found herself alone with questions she didn't know how to ask, and growing certainty that her troubles were far from over. Through the teepee's entrance flap, she could see children playing in morning sun, and their laughter's stark contrast to serious discussions taking place around council fire. One boy in particular caught her attention, perhaps 10 years old, with bright eyes and fearless energy that seemed to radiate from every pore. As if sensing her regard, the boy looked toward the teepee and flashed her a grin that reminded her painfully of her younger brother dead and these past 5 years from same consumption that had claimed their parents. The resemblance was so strong, it took her breath away, filling her with mixture of grief and unexpected warmth. When Chaska returned an hour later, his expression was grim, but not entirely hopeless. He settled beside the fire pit, with careful movements of someone who'd spent the past hour defending decisions he wasn't entirely sure were correct. "The council is divided," he said without preamble voice, carrying weariness of someone who'd been arguing with people he loved and respected. "Some want you returned to town immediately before your presence here can be used as justification for military action. Others believe we should escort you to the nearest stagecoach line and send you back east, where you'll be safe from whatever enemies you've made. Tokesa, different paths, all leading to the same end. And what do you believe?" Eliza asked, though something in his expression suggested she already knew the answer. He was quiet for a long moment, staring into flames with intensity that suggested he was seeing far more than dancing fire. When he finally looked at her, his dark eyes held resolution that made her breath catch in her throat. "I believe," he said slowly, "that some battles choose us, whether we're ready or not. And I believe that running from this particular battle would cost more lives than standing and fighting. Zuya, the warpath sometimes leads through darkness to find the light." Before she could ask what he meant, the boy she'd noticed earlier came bursting through the entrance flap with explosive energy that only children seemed to possess. He spoke rapidly in Lakota, his words tumbling over each other in excitement, but his bright eyes kept darting toward Eliza with undisguised curiosity. "This is Yiska," Chaska said, switching to English with fluid ease of someone who'd grown up speaking multiple languages. "My cousin's son. He wants to know if you're really the white woman who made the bad men so angry they're offering a reward for your capture." A reward? Eliza's blood chilled. "How much?" Yiska held up both hands, fingers spread wide, then did it again. $20 more money than most frontier families saw in a year, enough to make bounty hunting attractive for anyone desperate enough to try. "This makes everything more complicated," Chaska said grimly. $20 will bring every drifter and fortune hunter in 3 territories looking for you. Like wolves following blood scent. As if summoned by his words, the sound of approaching horses reached them from the direction of town. Not casual clip-clop of a single rider, but steady drumbeat of multiple animals moving at speed, the sound of men with purpose and weapons riding hard toward the camp. Chaska was already reaching for his rifle movements, economical and sure, despite obvious tension in his shoulders. "Stay here," he ordered, moving toward entrance flap. "Whatever happens, stay down and stay quiet. Najin Snee, do not stand, do not move." But as the first shouts of alarm arose from the camp's perimeter, Eliza realized that staying quiet might not be an option. Through the teepee's entrance, she could see people running their faces tight with fear and determination as they prepared to defend their homes against whatever threat approached. The battle for Willow Creek was about to begin, and she was at the center of it, whether she wanted to be or not. The attack came with methodical precision of a military operation, though the men who rode into the Lakota camp bore only loosest resemblance to professional soldiers. 3 riders thundered through the camp's perimeter, just as morning sun crested eastern hills, their horses lathered with sweat and their faces set with grim determination of men who'd come to finish unpleasant business. At their head rode Deputy Simon Hayes, his tin star glinting in early light, and his hand resting meaningfully on his revolver's grip. But it was the man beside him that made Eliza's blood turn to ice water in her veins. Thomas Iron Hand Rourke sat his black stallion with easy confidence of a man who had never doubted his own power or questioned his right to exercise it without restraint. At 45, he possessed commanding presence that made other men step aside without conscious thought. Broad shoulders straining fabric of his expensive black coat, pale blue eyes that missed nothing, and revealed exactly what he chose to reveal. But it was his left hand that had given him his nickname and reputation for ruthless efficiency. What had once been flesh and bone was now twisted mass of scar tissue barely concealed by black leather glove, result of a stampede that had crushed everything below the wrist beyond any hope of proper healing. That ruined hand had become his trademark visible reminder that Thomas Rourke had survived what would have killed lesser men and emerged stronger for the experience. "You're harboring stolen property," Hayes announced loudly, his voice carrying authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "We're here to reclaim what belongs to civilized folks and see that justice is properly served." Elder Wakan stepped forward with dignity of a man who had faced down worse threats than a few armed bullies. At 60, his weathered face remained impassive. Despite the insult, his dark eyes steady as he met Hayes's aggressive stare without flinching. "I see no stolen property here," he replied calmly in careful English that carried only slightest trace of accent. "Only hospitality offered to one in need as our customs demand and our hearts command. The diseased whore your boy stole from town." Hayes spat, his pale eyes scanning the camp for signs of resistance. "She's wanted for questioning about missing goods and inciting Indian unrest. Harboring a known criminal makes you accomplices under territorial law, and that's a hanging offense." Iron Hand urged his horse forward, his scarred hand resting on saddle horn with casual menace. "We tracked her to within a mile of this camp," he said smoothly, voice carrying cultured tones of someone who'd received education back east before coming west to build his empire. "Surely you don't expect us to believe she simply vanished into thin air. Everyone knows Indians are skilled at hiding things. They've stolen horses, cattle, white women. It was masterfully done, not direct accusation that could be immediately disproven, but suggestions that planted seeds of guilt by association." Eliza, watching from concealment inside Chaska's teepee, could see several Lakota warriors shift hands closer to weapons as implied threats registered. "You will search nothing," Wakan replied firmly, voice carrying authority of absolute conviction. "This is treaty land protected by agreements signed with your government in good faith. You have no authority here, no right to disturb our peace." "Authority?" Iron Hand's cold smile never wavered, but something predatory flickered in his pale eyes. "Captain, perhaps you'd care to explain our authority to these people." For the first time, Eliza noticed the third rider, a man in military uniform, whose ramrod posture and immaculate appearance spoke of years spent imposing order on untamed frontier. Captain Jonathan Sterling dismounted with crisp efficiency, his pale eyes surveying the camp with professional interest of someone evaluating potential threats and tactical advantages. As he adjusted his uniform jacket, Sterling's trained eye caught something that made him pause. One of Iron Hand's accompanying riders wore what appeared to be regulation cavalry insignia, but the arrangement was subtly wrong, a sergeant's stripes paired with a corporal's chevrons, the kind of mistake only someone unfamiliar with military protocol would make. "I am Captain Jonathan Sterling of the 7th Cavalry Regiment," he announced, voice carrying flat authority of military command, while his mind filed away the discrepancy for later consideration. "We have reports of stolen cattle-burned wagons and attacks on peaceful settlers throughout this region. This camp will be searched for evidence of these crimes, and any individuals found to be involved will be taken into custody for trial under military justice." "You have lies," Wakan said flatly, composure never wavering despite escalating tension. "My people have taken nothing, burned, nothing attacked, no one. We have lived in peace on land guaranteed to us by treaty, seeking only to raise our children and honor our ancestors." "Then you won't object to a thorough investigation to clear your names?" Sterling replied with logic that brooked no argument, though his eyes continued to study Iron Hand's men with growing suspicion. Any resistance will be considered an act of war against the United States government and will be met with appropriate force. The threat hung in morning air, like smoke from grass fire, heavy with promise of violence barely held in check. But before anyone could respond to ultimatum, commotion erupted from direction of the creek. Young Yiska came running into camp, his face flushed with excitement and terror in equal measure. "Wakan Tunkashila," he gasped in Lakota words tumbling over each other in his haste to be understood. "Akichita ota many soldiers at the old crossing. They have the blue coats, but they move wrong, smell wrong. Their horses carry no proper saddles, and their weapons shine too bright. Newly bought, not issued." The elder quickly translated for Captain Sterling's benefit voice, carefully neutral despite implications. "The boy says there are troops at Willow Creek Ford. But he also says something is not right about these soldiers. Their equipment appears new and improperly fitted." Sterling frowned at the boy's observation, confirming his own suspicions about the irregular insignia he'd noticed. Pulling out leather-bound dispatch book, he flipped through pages covered with neat military handwriting. "I wasn't informed of any additional units in this area," he said slowly, professional instincts immediately grasping that something was wrong with tactical situation. Iron Hand's expression flickered for just an instant, surprise, followed quickly by calculation and then by cold fury that came from having carefully laid plans disrupted by unexpected complications. But he recovered quickly, face resuming its mask of concerned civic authority. "Perhaps a patrol from Fort Harrison," he suggested smoothly, though his knuckles had gone white where they gripped saddle horn. Communications between military units can sometimes be irregular in frontier conditions. Could be they're just as surprised to see us as we are to see them. But Sterling was already barking orders to his sergeant military training, taking precedence over political considerations. A scout was dispatched to investigate reported troops while search of the camp continued with increased urgency as tactical situation grew more complex by the minute. It was then that Dr. Paul Morrison arrived, his familiar black bag, supplemented by air of professional authority that commanded immediate respect even from hardened cavalry officers. The physician's timing was either remarkably fortunate or carefully planned, appearing just as tensions reached breaking point. "Captain Sterling," he said formally, tipping his hat with courtesy due to fellow professional. "Dr. Paul Morrison. I provide medical services to several communities in this area, including regular vaccination schedules for this band." Sterling's expression softened slightly at sight of fellow educated white man, someone who could provide reliable testimony about character and activities of the camp's inhabitants. "Doctor, I wasn't aware you were in the area today." "Smallpox prevention," Morrison replied smoothly, tone carrying authority of medical expertise that few frontier residents would dare question. "These people have been entirely cooperative with territorial health regulations. In fact, I've found them to be remarkably law-abiding and conscientious about community welfare. Never had a lick of trouble from any of them." Iron Hand's eyes narrowed dangerously as he recognized potential threat to his narrative. "Dr. Morrison," he interjected with false cordiality, "I'm sure your medical expertise is valuable, but perhaps you're not aware of this woman's history of mental instability. I've heard reports of her making wild accusations against respectable businessmen claiming to see things that simply weren't there. Hysteria is common among unmarried women who've suffered disappointments." The attack was subtle but vicious, designed to undermine Morrison's credibility by suggesting his medical judgment was compromised by sympathy for a deranged patient. But the doctor's response revealed depths of personal investment that Iron Hand hadn't anticipated. Cooperation with medical procedures doesn't explain burned wagons and missing cattle. Iron Hand continued pressing his advantage. especially when we have sworn testimony from reliable witnesses about this camp's involvement in recent incidents. Morrison's jaw tightened, and when he spoke again, his voice carried weight of years spent building an unassailable case. I'm merely providing context for the character of the community based on my professional interactions with them. But if we're discussing patterns of evidence, perhaps Captain Sterling would be interested in the medical records I've been compiling over the past several years. He opened his medical bag, revealing not just instruments, but collection of documents and photographs that spoke of careful documentation and systematic investigation. Missing women, Captain. Young ladies who come to various frontier towns seeking employment and then simply vanish without trace or explanation. I have 23 documented cases showing injury patterns consistent with prolonged confinement and systematic abuse. Iron Hand's face darkened, but he maintained his facade of civic concern. Dr. Morrison, I'd be very careful about making unsubstantiated accusations that could damage reputations and business interests. A man's livelihood. My sister was one of those women. Morrison said quietly, his words carrying across the camp like thunder. Catherine Morrison, 22 years old, blonde hair, green eyes. Came through Willow Springs 5 years ago looking for honest work. I ain't seen hide nor hair of her since, but I found evidence in those back rooms you keep so carefully locked. The revelation transformed Morrison from neutral medical authority into someone with personal stakes in whatever truth was about to be revealed. Eliza felt her heart clench as she realized the depth of his involvement, the personal pain that had been driving his careful investigation. These are health reports from mining camps throughout the territory. Morrison continued spreading papers on nearby stump with methodical care. Each documents treatment of women bearing injuries that tell a story: malnutrition, untreated wounds, psychological trauma consistent with imprisonment and abuse. My sister's name appears in the earliest records, along with notation that she died of fever after attempting to escape. Captain Sterling studied the documents with growing concern, his professional eye recognizing detailed documentation that would stand up in military tribunal. How many women are we discussing, Doctor? At least 23 that I can verify through direct medical examination. Morrison replied grimly, voice carrying weight of years spent building unassailable case. Probably twice that many who've been too frightened or ashamed to seek medical attention. Each one somebody's daughter, somebody's sister, somebody's lost hope. The revelation hung in morning air, like smell of gunpowder, heavy with implications that went far beyond simple criminal activity. Sterling looked from documents to Iron Hand, whose expression had shifted from confident authority to barely concealed rage as his carefully constructed facade began to crumble. These are very serious allegations, the captain said carefully, military training demanding verification before action. But his tone suggested he was already convinced of their validity. Based on solid medical evidence that I'm prepared to present to territorial authorities, Morrison replied with confidence of someone who'd spent years building unassailable case. Evidence that suggests coordinated criminal enterprise operating under protection of local corruption. My sister deserved better than what she got, and so do all the others. That was when the shooting started. The first shots came from direction of the creek, not random pops of target practice or hunting, but disciplined volleys of men engaged in serious combat. The sound built quickly from sporadic cracks to sustained crackling that sent birds exploding from cottonwoods and set every horse in the camp to whinnying and dancing with alarm. "Contact!" Someone shouted from Sterling's perimeter voice, carrying urgency that came from seeing muzzle flashes and hearing bullets whine overhead. "We're under attack from the creek. Multiple hostiles, organized fire." Captain Sterling's head snapped toward sound of gunfire, his professional instincts immediately overriding all other considerations. The irregular insignia, the boy's observations about improper equipment, Morrison's evidence of conspiracy, it all crystallized into understanding of the trap they'd walked into. "Sergeant Wilson," he barked, voice cutting through chaos with military precision. "Defensive positions, but watch your targets. We may not be facing who we think we are." Yerdalf, but Iron Hand was already moving with fluid efficiency of someone who'd planned every detail of what was about to unfold. The revolver that appeared in his undamaged right hand seemed to materialize from thin air, its barrel swinging toward Elder Wakan with deadly intent. His first shot took the dignified old man in the chest, heavy bullets spinning him around and dropping him where he stood. Blood began to spread across his shirt front as he fell, weathered hands clutching at wound with desperate strength. "Treachery!" Iron Hand roared, voice carrying clearly across the camp with authority that commanded immediate attention. "They've led us into an ambush. The whole thing was a trap. Kill them all." The camp erupted into chaos as Sterling soldiers began returning fire. But their training and discipline showed as they maintained formation and fired only at identified targets. The contrast with the wild shooting from Iron Hand's hidden men was stark professional military discipline versus mercenary desperation. Smoke from dozens of black powder charges began to drift across lodges like morning fog, turning peaceful camp into vision of hell. The acrid smell of burned gunpowder mixed with dust and blood, creating haze that burned throat and stung eyes. Inside the teepee, Eliza found herself trapped in nightmare of sound and smoke. Bullets tore through buffalo hide walls with increasing frequency, each impact sending showers of debris onto the floor, where she crouched in terror. But her terror turned to immediate danger when the entrance flap was suddenly torn aside and a figure burst through, not Chaska, but one of Iron Hand's men, a scarred gunman with wild eyes and a smoking revolver in his hand. "Well, well," he snarled, his voice rough from tobacco and whiskey. "Look what we got here. The little dove that started all this trouble." Eliza scrambled backward, her hand closing around the first thing she could find, a piece of firewood from beside the pit. The man laughed at her makeshift weapon, advancing with predatory confidence. "Don't make this harder than it has to be, girl. Boss wants you alive, but he didn't say in what condition." He lunged forward, reaching for her with hands that reeked of gunpowder and blood. Eliza swung the firewood with desperate strength, catching him across the temple hard enough to stagger him. But he recovered quickly, backhanding her across the face with force that sent her sprawling. "You little hellcat, I'm gonna enjoy breaking you." As he raised his gun to strike her, Eliza remembered her father's lessons about hunting, not just the shooting, but the tracking, the patience, the knowledge that survival sometimes meant making hard choices. She rolled aside as the gun descended, then grabbed a handful of hot coals from the fire pit and flung them into his face. The man screamed, clawing at his burning eyes, his gun forgotten as he stumbled backward. Eliza snatched up a hunting knife from Chaska's belongings and held it with both hands, the blade trembling but pointed directly at her attacker's chest. "Stay back!" she gasped, blood streaming from her split lip. "I swear I'll cut you if you come any closer." Through the smoke and chaos outside, she could hear Chaska's voice shouting commands in Lakota and knew he was torn between defending the camp and protecting her. The choice was hers to make cry for help and potentially cost lives in the larger battle or finish this fight herself. The gunman, half blind but still dangerous, fumbled for his weapon. "I'm gonna kill you slow for that, you little—" He never finished the threat. As he raised his revolver, Eliza lunged forward with the knife, her father's hunting lessons guiding her hands. The blade found its mark just below his ribs, sliding between bone with sickening ease. The gunman looked down at the knife protruding from his chest with surprise, then toppled backward through the entrance flap, his weapon clattering away into the dust. Eliza stared at her blood-stained hands, in shock the reality of what she'd done, hitting her like a physical blow. She'd killed a man, not in distant battle, but face to face, close enough to see the life leave his eyes. But there was no time for remorse or reflection. Through the torn entrance flap, she could see the battle raging with desperate intensity. Chaska and the Lakota warriors had taken positions behind overturned wagons and scattered equipment using their knowledge of the terrain to maximize their defensive advantage. But they were outnumbered, and Iron Hand's mercenaries were pressing their attack with the desperation of men who knew they faced execution if they failed. Outside the teepee, the battle had evolved into something that resembled a professional military engagement more than a simple raid. The Lakota warriors, under Chaska's tactical guidance, had abandoned any notion of standing their ground in favor of a fluid defense that utilized every advantage their terrain knowledge provided. Hokahe Anpokin Li. Chaska's war cry rose above the gunfire as he led a flanking movement through the willows. Today we fight for our families. The warriors moved like smoke through the landscape, appearing to fire devastating volleys before melting away into cover the mercenaries couldn't see or understand. It was guerrilla warfare at its most effective, turning superior numbers into a liability rather than an advantage. But the mercenaries were learning adapting their tactics under the pressure of professional necessity. Their leader, a grizzled veteran with Confederate cavalry experience, began organizing his men into proper military formations designed to clear defensive positions through coordinated fire and movement. Young Yiska, watching the battle develop from his position near the horse corral, saw opportunity where others saw only chaos. The mercenaries had positioned their mounts in a rough line behind their firing positions, making them vulnerable to exactly the kind of raid Lakota warriors had perfected over generations of horse warfare. Without waiting for orders or permission, the 10-year-old boy began working his way through the sagebrush toward the enemy horses. His plan was simple but dangerous. If he could stampede their mounts, the mercenaries would be stranded on foot, giving the defenders a critical advantage. But his movement caught the attention of one of Iron Hand's men, a lean gunfighter who raised his rifle to put a bullet through the small figure creeping through the brush. Yiska! Chaska's shout of warning came just as the gunman's finger tightened on the trigger. The Lakota warrior was faced with an impossible choice: maintain his position and coordinate the defense, or abandon his tactical advantage to save his young cousin. For a heartbeat that seemed to last forever, time suspended as competing loyalties tore at his heart. Then training and love merged into action. Chaska sprinted from cover, drawing fire from multiple positions as he raced toward where Yiska lay exposed in the open ground. Bullets whined around him like angry wasps, one scoring a red line across his ribs, another burning through his hair close enough to singe scalp. He reached Yiska just as the boy's small hands closed on the lead rope holding the mercenaries' horses. Together, uncle and nephew yanked the picket line free, sending 23 horses galloping across the prairie in a thundering stampede that carried away the mercenaries' means of escape. Now they fight like trapped animals. Chaska gasped as he pulled Yiska to safety behind an overturned wagon. Dangerous, but desperate. The boy's eyes shone with pride and excitement, despite the blood streaming from a bullet graze on his arm. Did I do good, uncle? Did I help win the battle? You did more than good, little warrior. You may have saved us all. But even as he spoke, Chaska knew the battle was far from over. The mercenaries, now faced with the choice between victory and death, would fight with the ferocity of cornered predators. And somewhere in the chaos, Iron Hand Rourke was still alive, still dangerous, still capable of turning desperate defeat into Pyrrhic victory. The tide of battle was shifting, but the outcome remained balanced on the edge of a knife, waiting for one final act to tip the scales toward justice or catastrophe. As if summoned by his thoughts, Iron Hand's voice rose above the gunfire, no longer smooth and controlled, but raw with fury and desperation. "Burn it all," he screamed at his remaining men. "If we can't have victory, we'll have vengeance. Leave nothing alive." The mercenaries responded with increased ferocity, their disciplined volleys giving way to wild, destructive fire, aimed more at causing maximum damage than achieving tactical objectives. Lodge poles' splintered hide covers burst into flame, and the careful order of the Lakota camp began to dissolve into smoking ruin. But Captain Sterling, finally understanding the full scope of the deception practiced upon him, rallied his men with the authority of righteous anger. "Fix bayonets." He commanded, his voice cutting through chaos with military precision. "These aren't soldiers, they're murderers in uniform, and by God, we'll treat them as such. Forward march." The sight of regular cavalry advancing with steel gleaming at the ends of their rifles broke whatever discipline remained among the mercenaries. Some threw down their weapons and ran. Others fought with suicidal desperation. Still others simply stood in shock as their carefully planned operation collapsed into bloody chaos. In the center of it all, Iron Hand Rourke faced the destruction of everything he'd built with the cold calculation that had made him feared throughout the territory. If he couldn't escape with victory, he would at least ensure that no witnesses survived to testify against him. Drawing a second revolver from beneath his coat, he began moving through the battle toward where he'd last seen Eliza, determined to claim at least one final victory from the wreckage of his empire. But Chaska had seen him coming, and the Lakota warrior was already moving to intercept, setting up what would become the final confrontation between justice and corruption in the smoking ruins of what had once been a peaceful camp. The two men met in the space between burning lodges, surrounded by the chaos of dying battle, but isolated in their own private war. Iron Hand's ruined left hand gripped a knife, while his right held the revolver, making him a formidable opponent despite his injuries. Chaska carried only his traditional weapons knife and tomahawk, but his eyes held the focused intensity of a man defending everything he held sacred. "Should have minded your own business, redskin." Iron Hand snarled, raising his gun. "Now you'll die for nothing, and your woman will learn what real men do to troublemakers." "My woman," Chaska replied quietly, "has already proven she can handle men like you, and you will not live to threaten her again." The fight was brief, but savage. Iron Hand's size and reach gave him initial advantage, but Chaska's speed and skill gradually wore down the older man's strength. When it ended, Iron Hand lay motionless in the trampled earth. His reign of terror finally concluded. As silence gradually returned to the battlefield, broken only by the moans of wounded and the crackle of dying fires, Eliza emerged from the ruined teepee to find Chaska kneeling beside the body of his enemy, not in triumph, but in something approaching sorrow. "It's over," she said, placing her hand on his shoulder. "This part is over." He agreed, rising to face her with eyes that held new shadows. But the work of healing for all of us has only just begun. Around them, the survivors of both sides began the grim work of counting the cost of justice, while in the distance the sound of approaching hoofbeats announced the arrival of federal marshals who would help sort truth from deception in the aftermath of the bloodiest day in Willow Springs' short history. But that was still to come. For now, there was only the satisfaction of survival and the knowledge that sometimes, when evil seemed too powerful to defeat ordinary people, could still choose to stand together and fight for what was right. The storm had passed, but its echoes would resonate through their lives for years to come, shaping the future they would build together from the ashes of what had been destroyed. 3 weeks later, Eliza stood on the wooden platform of Willow Springs train depot, watching morning sun paint prairie grass gold in distance, while gentle breeze carried scents of sage and new possibilities. The westbound train would arrive within an hour, carrying territorial marshals and federal investigators to oversee final prosecution of what newspapers throughout region were calling the Willow Springs Conspiracy. The town itself bore little resemblance to place she'd first encountered when stepping off Stagecoach with nothing but hope and false job advertisement. The Lantern's End had been shuttered and transformed into territorial courthouse, its dark reputation replaced by promise of justice, fairly administered. Several prominent businessmen faced charges ranging from conspiracy to accessory to murder, while others had simply disappeared in night, rather than face consequences of their complicity. But it was personal transformations that meant most to Eliza, individual stories of recovery and redemption that reminded her why struggle had been worthwhile. Sarah Fletcher had returned to her uncle's farm, where she was slowly recovering with help of family friends and Dr. Morrison's professional care. The young woman was resilient, her natural optimism gradually reasserting itself as she learned to trust in her safety again. She'd even expressed interest in helping other survivors, turning her own suffering into a source of strength for others who needed to know healing was possible. "I want to teach," she'd told Eliza during one of their conversations. "Want to help other girls learn to read and write so they can't be tricked like I was. Knowledge is power, ain't it? And power is protection." Maria Santos had been reunited with brothers she'd been seeking when she first came to Willow Springs, and together they decided to start fresh in California, where no one knew their story, and they could build new lives, free from shadows of past. Her brother's tears of joy when he saw her alive had been matched only by his rage when he learned what she'd endured. But love had proven stronger than anger as they focused on future rather than dwelling on what couldn't be changed. Most moving of all had been Wyanette's reunion with her mother. The rescue from Felix Garrett's mine hideout had required delicate negotiation with Eliza, talking the desperate gambler into surrender through appeal to whatever humanity remained in his damaged soul. The young woman bore strong resemblance to Ayanna, with same intelligent dark eyes and proud bearing that no amount of abuse had been able to completely destroy. "She was here," Ayanna had said, when they found evidence of her daughter's captivity. "Recently, very recently. I can smell her hair, the soap I taught her to make from buffalo fat and prairie sage." The confrontation at the mine had tested everyone's courage and resolve. Felix, cornered and desperate, had held Wyanette at gunpoint, while federal marshals surrounded his hideout. But instead of violence, the standoff had ended with words Eliza's patient appeal to his humanity, combined with Wyanette's own quiet courage in the face of mortal danger. "You remember what it felt like to be human," Eliza had told the broken gambler, "before the money and power corrupted everything decent in you. She's 17 years old, Felix. She has her whole life ahead of her. Don't let your story end in murder." In the end, Felix had simply let go of his weapon, his hostage, his desperate attempt to escape justice. "What's the point anymore?" he'd said wearily. Maybe it's time to remember what that means." "Second thoughts?" Dr. Morrison asked, approaching with his familiar black bag and concerned expression that had made him such effective healer of both bodies and spirits. "About testifying at the trials, no." Eliza adjusted her new traveling dress gift from grateful women of Willow Springs, who had finally learned truth about their missing daughters and sisters. "About leaving this place, maybe." The past 3 weeks had been whirlwind of statements, depositions, and legal proceedings as full scope of conspiracy was slowly revealed. But they'd also been filled with something else. Long conversations by creek with Chaska, shared meals around evening fires, and gradual deepening of connection that had begun in crisis and grown into something far more profound and lasting. "The territory will miss you," Dr. Morrison said, tone carrying genuine regret mixed with understanding. There's already talk of appointing you as advocate for women's rights in frontier communities. The territorial governor mentioned your name specifically in his latest dispatch to Washington. I appreciate the confidence, Eliza replied, voice carrying mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. But I think I've had enough of politics and public attention for one lifetime. Too much blood shed, too many lives lost. Time to focus on building rather than fighting. What she didn't say was that her decision had more to do with what she was leaving behind than what she was moving toward. The past weeks had seen her growing closer to Chaska in ways that transcended their shared ordeal, their relationship deepening through quiet moments and gentle touches that spoke of feelings too profound for words. He'd visited town regularly during investigation, serving as translator and cultural liaison between Lakota witnesses and territorial authorities who needed their testimony to build cases against remaining conspirators. Each time he'd made point of checking on her welfare, bringing small gifts of beadwork or prairie flowers that spoke of thoughts shared but not yet voiced. The chemistry between them was undeniable connection that had been forged in violence, but tempered in quieter moments of recovery and healing. But so were practical realities that made any future together seem impossibly complicated. There's another reason you're hesitating, Dr. Morrison observed with gentle insight that made him such effective physician and counselor. Before Eliza could respond, sound of approaching horses drew their attention to depot's entrance. Chaska rode into view, leading pack horse, and accompanied by young Yiska, who had appointed himself the warrior's permanent shadow and self-proclaimed protector in weeks since battle. You're leaving, Chaska said without preamble, dismounting with fluid grace, despite still healing shoulder wound. The train departs in 20 minutes. Eliza confirmed, heart hammering against ribs with intensity that made breathing difficult. I have teaching position waiting in Philadelphia. Chance to make real difference in young women's lives, to use what I've learned here to help others who might face similar challenges. Good, he said simply, dark eyes meeting hers with intensity that seemed to see straight through to her soul. You'll be excellent, teacher. Those students will be fortunate to learn from someone with your courage and compassion. The words were supportive, but something in his tone suggested deeper currents beneath surface politeness. Yiska, meanwhile, was practically vibrating with barely contained excitement that suggested he knew something adults hadn't yet shared. Tell her, Chaska, the boy urged, switching between Lakota and English with fluid ease. Tell her about the letter from the government men in Denver. What letter? Eliza asked, curiosity overriding her attempts to maintain emotional distance. Chaska reached into his shirt and withdrew folded piece of paper, its official seal immediately recognizable as territorial government stationery. From the Bureau of Indian Affairs, he said, voice carefully neutral, despite significance of what he was sharing. They're offering me position as cultural liaison and translator based on my work during the investigation and testimony of Captain Sterling and Dr. Morrison. That's wonderful, Eliza said, and meant it despite way her heart seemed to be breaking into small pieces. The position would provide steady income and official recognition of his skills, both rare commodities for Native Americans in current political climate, where government policy seemed designed to erase rather than celebrate cultural differences. The position is based in Denver. Chaska continued, dark eyes never leaving her face, as if memorizing every detail for future reference. With regular travel throughout territory to resolve disputes and facilitate negotiations between government representatives and tribal leaders. Bridge building, they call it. Making peace where there was only war before. Denver, the territorial capital with direct rail connections to major cities throughout country, including Philadelphia. It's good opportunity, she said carefully, not trusting herself to say more without revealing emotions she wasn't sure she was ready to acknowledge. It is, he agreed. But it means leaving my people at least temporarily. Adopting white man's clothing for official meetings, living in world that sees me as curiosity at best and threat at worst. Learning to navigate social conventions that have nothing to do with honor or truth. Eliza understood magnitude of what he was describing, profound sacrifice involved in abandoning not just place, but entire way of being in world. For a man who'd spent his entire life as part of tight-knit community, where every person had defined role and clear purpose, the isolation would be almost unbearable. Why would you consider it? She asked, though part of her already suspected answer. Instead of responding directly, Chaska reached into his pack and withdrew a small leather bundle wrapped with kind of care reserved for precious things. Inside, protected by soft deerskin, was most beautiful piece of beadwork Eliza had ever seen, vest decorated with intricate patterns in blues and whites that seemed to capture essence of sky and prairie grass, of wind and water, and all unnatural forces that shaped life on frontier. I started this the night after we first met, he said quietly, voice carrying weight of confession. When I knew I'd found something worth fighting for, worth changing my entire life to protect and cherish. Each bead placed with prayer, each pattern chosen to tell our story. The implications of gift were unmistakable to anyone familiar with Lakota customs. Such elaborate beadwork was traditionally created by women for their husbands or men they intended to marry, each pattern carrying symbolic meaning that told story of their relationship and hopes for future. For a warrior to create such piece himself was declaration of intent that transcended cultural boundaries and spoke of feelings too deep for ordinary words. Chaska, she began, but he held up hand to stop her protests before they could fully form. I'm not asking you to stay, he said, voice carrying quiet strength that had drawn her to him from their first meeting. I know you have dreams, plans, life waiting for you back east, where you'll be safe and respected. But I'm asking you to consider that some journeys are meant to be taken together, that some dreams are bigger when they're shared. The teaching position in Philadelphia. Denver has schools, he interrupted gently. New university that's actively recruiting qualified instructors. More opportunities for someone with your intelligence and determination than dozen Philadelphias, and chance to help build something entirely new rather than simply maintaining what already exists. It was true, and they both knew it. And they both... The growing Western territories were desperate for educated women willing to help build institutions and civilize frontier communities according to their own vision, rather than simply importing Eastern conventions wholesale. Her skills would be not just welcome, but essential in shaping future of region that was still defining itself. But it would also mean abandoning security of carefully planned future for uncertainty of love on frontier, where social conventions were still being written, and where interracial couple would face challenges that couldn't be overcome through good intentions alone. The train whistle sounded in distance, its mournful calls echoing across prairie and marking approaching moment, when she would have to choose between safe path and unknown one. I need to know, she said carefully, voice barely audible above sound of her own heartbeat. That this isn't just gratitude or some misguided sense of obligation. That you're not offering to change your entire life out of guilt over what happened or because you feel responsible for my welfare. Chaska stepped closer, close enough that she could see gold flecks in his dark eyes and smell sage and wood smoke scent that seemed to cling to his hair and skin like blessing from land itself. Do you remember? He asked softly, breath warm against her cheek. That first night in my tipi when I cleaned your wound and we sat by fire talking about storms. She nodded, not trusting voice to remain steady. I knew then, he said, words carrying weight of absolute truth. Before the battles, before the investigation, before any of violence and chaos that followed. I knew that whatever happened next, I wanted you beside me to face it. Not because I felt obligated to protect you, but because I couldn't imagine facing the future without you. Waste Sadek, I love you completely, in all ways that matter. The train was visible now, black speck growing larger on horizon as it approached with inevitability of time itself. In minutes, she would have to choose between life she'd planned and life she'd never dared to dream possible. And if we try this and it doesn't work? She asked, voicing fears that had kept her awake for weeks. If the cultural differences are too great, if society won't accept us, if we can't build something lasting from what we've shared, then we'll have tried. Chaska replied, voice carrying quiet courage that had sustained his people through generations of challenge and change. And we'll have known what it means to choose love over fear, hope over safety. Some things are worth the risk, Eliza. Some things are worth everything. Before she could respond, young Yiska tugged on her skirt with urgency that suggested he had information crucial to decisions she was trying to make. I learned to read English newspapers, he announced proudly, young voice carrying satisfaction of someone who'd mastered difficult skill. Dr. Morrison taught me during long days when everyone was giving testimony to government men. Want to see what I found? The boy pulled out carefully folded newspaper clipping, its headline clear, despite small fingerprints along edges that testified to how often he'd handled it. Territorial law recognizes interracial marriage rights. It says Indians and whites can get married legally now. Yiska explained with seriousness of someone delivering momentous news. As long as both people agree and follow proper procedures, nobody can stop them or say it doesn't count. The law protects love, Auntie Eliza. She looked at Dr. Morrison, who was trying unsuccessfully to hide smile that suggested he'd played role in Boy's research. You knew about this. The law was passed 8 months ago. Morrison admitted tone-carrying satisfaction of someone who'd been waiting for right moment to share important information. Part of Territory's effort to encourage stable relationships and reduce social tensions between different communities. I may have mentioned it to certain interested parties who seemed concerned about legal obstacles to their happiness. The train pulled into station with great hissing of steam and squealing of brakes, its black bulk dominating platform as passengers began disembarking while others gathered luggage for departure. The conductor's voice carried clearly across platform, marking final moments before departure. All aboard for Denver, Colorado Springs and points east, he called. Departure in 5 minutes, all aboard. Chaska held out his hand to her palm, up in gesture that managed to be both invitation and question. The calloused strength of his fingers spoke of life spent in honest labor, while gentleness of his touch promised kind of partnership built on mutual respect rather than dominance or submission. Come with me, he said simply, voice cutting through all complexity and uncertainty to focus on essential choice before them. Help me build something new, something that honors both our worlds while creating space for dreams we haven't even imagined yet. Mitakuye o Yasin, we are all related, and together we can make that mean something beautiful. Eliza looked at his outstretched hand and then at Train that represented her carefully planned future. Then back at Man, who offered her different kind of life entirely, one built on love and shared purpose, rather than mere security and social convention. The choice, when it came, was easier than she'd expected. Her hand found his with kind of certainty that came from finally recognizing what she'd been searching for all along, even when she hadn't known she was searching. Denver it is, she said, and felt her heart begin beating in rhythm that matched his own. The wedding took place 10 weeks later in Denver's territorial courthouse, officiated by a federal judge who'd made his reputation by treating all citizens equally regardless of race or social standing. The ceremony was witnessed by a collection of friends who had become family through shared adversity and mutual respect, people who understood that love could transcend artificial boundaries that society tried to impose on human relationships. 8 months later, Eliza Whitmore Morrison opened Denver Territory Academy for Young Women, first institution of its kind, to offer equal education to students regardless of race, economic background, or social standing. The Academy's first class included Sarah Fletcher, who discovered remarkable talent for mathematics, and Wyanet, whose facility with multiple languages made her invaluable as cultural interpreter. Education is freedom. Eliza told her students during opening ceremony, her voice carrying across newly constructed classroom where young women of different backgrounds sat side by side. Knowledge is power, and power is protection. No one can take from you what you carry in your mind and heart. 2 years later, as autumn painted aspen leaves gold, and Eliza felt their first child move beneath her heart, she would look back on that terrifying night by Willow Creek and understand that sometimes worst moments of our lives are simply beginning of our best ones. Their son would be born the following spring on day when prairie grass turned green and buffalo returned to ancestral grazing grounds. They would name him Thomas, not for the evil man who tried to destroy them, but for the strength it took to overcome him. His middle name would be Chaska, linking him to both worlds he would inherit. The storm that had brought them together had passed, but love they'd built in its aftermath would endure for generations, testament to power of choosing hope over fear, and possibility of creating something beautiful from even darkest circumstances.